On behalf of the Nottingham and Derby Society of Architects and the Women in Architecture, Nottingham and Derby Society of Architects and the Women in Architecture, the REBA Women in Architecture group, I welcome you to this 2-day online drawing workshop. It's our first collaborative event between the NDSA and Women in Architecture group, in which we will together explore drawing as a means of exploration of our immediate environment.
Thank you so much, Aisha. And this evening I will be sharing my experience and some observations, a little bit of theory, but mostly a lot of drawings, which combine this interest with the view from the window and particularly how we might approach that in a mindful way. So I just want to thank everybody for actually taking the time, because it is a busy time of year, and a lot of what we're really touching on this evening is taking some time to just stop and slow down, even just for a couple of minutes, and notice our built environment and notice the world around us, and to actually notice a bit of how we're feeling, because it's all too easy to rush through life with lots of things to do, and to be talking about well-being and the built environment, to talk about qualities of architecture, but not actually be experiencing it ourselves, kind of doing it in our heads, or thinking about the past, thinking about what needs to be happening in an hour's time. So I kind of invite you to indulge in this next hour, or a little bit less, to just take in some information. Here, as you can see, be commencing with a drawing, but what we'll be covering, as Aisha explained, exploring how a particular type of drawing, observational drawing of our immediate window views, may provide this awareness of place and what this can do for us, and also how in fact sharing some of our work and our experiences is itself conducive to well-being. I mean, we've got a lot of social isolation at the moment, so even if it's in a virtual environment, being able to share our experiences and our observations at this time, I think, and from my own experience of doing this through this project already, has been a really positive one. So I will cover some background theory. As an academic, I kind of can't help myself, but I'll keep that bit short, because then you'll see my work, and then we'll end with the invitation and then come back again a bit later on. So here we are in COVID. I'll just shut my camera off here so you can see the screen in full. This is from Public Health England, who acknowledged that being in lockdown has a lot of potential negative sort of mental health effects for us all. The very final line here on this screen is that it's important to take care of your mind and your body. And I propose there's several ways that we can do this. As I press my screen, sorry, I am moving to the next slide, but my laptop's not wanting to. There we go. So the Yale Medical School has pointed out back in May, in fact, that mindfulness is a practice that can help us cope with anxiety, with stress, and to actually just actually thrive and flourish more in our moment-to-moment experience. I won't talk about a lot of mindfulness as in terms of formal meditation or go through the theory about it, but I'll kind of try to demonstrate it through my own work. And you're welcome. I'm happy to share these sides of the slides later if people want to look any of these up. But what I've found particularly pertinent to us who are interested in or working in the built environment is that this definition of mindfulness by a parliamentary group back in 2015, so the UK government, defined it as not as meditation, but as paying attention to what's happening in the present moment in the mind, body and external environment with an attitude of curiosity and kindness. So, as I mentioned, often we're in a world of our own thoughts and concerns or distractions. So even if you're sitting here this evening, you might have had a busy day, you might have had a great exciting day or a calm, slow day. But just to even pause for a moment now and have a look at your posture, have a look at how your body's feeling. Are you already checking emails in the background? Are you distracted? thinking about what comes next. And are you being kind to yourself and curious? Are you thinking about what could have been, what should have been, or are you just able to be in the here and now? That's the sort of essence of being mindful. And it's actually a skill we can learn, quite a difficult one to master. But in fact, if we notice that we're not noticing, we have indeed been mindful. So I hope when you're all eating dinner later after this, if you're not eating already, you can really taste the food, you can smell it. Again, that would be a mindful experience. But what I've been doing with drawing is to see if I can mindfully pay more attention to my external environment, to the world around me. And I'm not alone in this endeavour. So this is from the Royal Society for the Protection of Birds back in July. Here they were asking people around the UK during lockdown to, as it says here, has the last few months made you appreciate your local green spaces more? Maybe you've noticed the wildlife in your garden or local park for the first time, or been inspired to create some wild art or music. And indeed, you know, there are mental health benefits of engaging with nature in this way. The artist David Hockney put out a similar recommendation to us. He is fortunate to be in lockdown in Normandy, in France, I believe, and he's there drawing the view from his window or of the French landscape, and sharing that with us. And he made a particular point about saying, don't take photos. He actually says that drawing in itself is a particularly important way of seeing. And I'll just quote here in this article, he went on to state, I would suggest they really look hard at something and think about what they're really seeing. We need art, and I do think it can relieve stress. Because what is stress? It's worrying about something in the future. Art is now. So to me, that's actually a description of mindfulness at work. And this is not a new idea. This is John Ruskin, the prolific art and architectural critic and artist in his own right, from the Victorian era. And a beautiful drawing of his where he studied a building detail, which itself is a carving of natural forms of birds and of flora and fauna. And Ruskin wrote about drawing, and he wrote about architecture and about nature. And I love this quote where he points out that when he was asking his students to draw, it wasn't just because they could become better at drafting and drawing, but that drawing was a way of seeing nature and actually learning to love it. It's the close, detailed view that we have, not just when we hold a camera up to our eye, but when we engage our hand and our eyes and all our body, and almost can go into a kind of space where we're really connected to the thing or the object or the space or the place that we're drawing and putting down on paper. Which leads me now to windows as a particular subject to draw. And I found myself doing it intuitively, but at the start of lockdown. But windows have become such a huge part. Of course, Aisha said she's actually studied this through her research. I hope everyone gets to check that out. But it's been very much in the popular media. So there've been, invitations for people to post their window views. We've seen NHS messages up in people's windows, and this other final page down the bottom here, Window Swap, is a website where people have been filming a static clip of their window, including sound and movement, and you can just go on there and look at it and have it in the background. So this idea that there's this kind of urge to be creative and actually share something of our experience of the view during this time. So I think these practices reveal how the act of noticing, recording, sharing, and indeed celebrating our windows has become part of the COVID-19 experience of being, on one hand, of being isolated, but also illustrating a sort of collective creative attempt to adapt and make sense of this. Which leads me to the drawings. So you will see a lot of drawings. They're going to whiz by pretty fast, and I'm not going to talk about each one. I'm just going to tell you about some overall themes, and I invite you to watch my day-by-day drawing, because this is the first one, 17th of March. I came home from work, from the university, and I sat by the first floor window in my terrace and I sketched the view of two rather pensive-looking trees, which we'll see again and again. As I said, I'd had a rather unnerving day earlier. There had been students in the lecture hall with masks on their faces, and I'd been told I had to evacuate my place of work and didn't know when I'd be coming back. So I can't exactly say why I just sat on the couch that evening and pulled out a sketchbook. Because since my architecture school days, I've loved to draw. But often these days it's only been when I do travel or visit a building, for example, or in studio that I'm drawing. It isn't something I've necessarily done just of an evening, but that evening I did. And as you can see, it became somewhat of an obsession to draw every day. And pretty early on, I saw it actually as a means of recording what was going on in the world around me during the day and at night. So I did it in fact till mid-October, so you're going to see over 200 of these drawings. Sometimes in the morning, sometimes late at night when I ran out of time. Sometimes they only took a few seconds, and sometimes I dwelt there a bit longer. Sometimes I didn't have a plan of when I would draw, but actually as I walked past the window or was in the room and looked up, something caught my eye and I kind of almost had to take time out from what I was doing and just capture that moment. Other times I sat at the window, saw the same thing I'd been seeing every day, really, the same trees, sometimes the same people, but in a mindful way, I set myself the challenge to, as we call it, beginner's mind, trying to almost look at that view as if I'd never seen it before and really pay attention to really see, not just draw it automatically, but to really see what is there here and now and just be in that moment. So my practice quickly evolved from kind of just, a one-off thing into a quite reflective and also theoretically informed practice. And I'd say the key themes or questions that are kind of embedded in this work, and which I'll explore through some of these comments and other writing I hope to do, is first of all, what is the relationship between people, health, and the places that we're locked down in? And how are we sort of negotiating that? How can nature and architecture enable or inhibit social distancing, or also allow us to connect to each other? And in a time when we are presented with daily quantitative statistics about mortality and infection, what can qualitative forms of research, in this case, very subjective drawing, reveal about the individual lived experience of lockdown? And perhaps how can we as designers learn from taking this time and looking at the world in this way? And then from a personal perspective, what do we gain from actually doing this, from taking this time? And there's also a lot of theory that suggests that visual art and creative practice is itself inherently related to well-being and satisfaction. And by the way, that was a window cleaner who would stop and talk to the elderly residents inside while he was cleaning the windows. So let's talk about the window first. It's framing and delimiting the view, and it's a worthy subject in its own right. You've seen some of the images I do draw the window. It's a double hung sash, for those who want to know. It's double glazed. It is a contemporary retrofit, so it was replacing the original Victorian glass, but faithfully copying the original, just better for thermal property. It lets in the afternoon light, and over summer the direction of the sun and the length of the shadows changed the amount of daylight and internal conditions quite a lot. Sometimes I paid attention to the window as a compositional device, the glazing bars, the sash horns, the brass pulls, and indeed we often just sort of take them for granted, but clearly it's an important aspect of our experience. My former colleagues at Nottingham, John Chilton and Benson Lau, have written that in addition to serving the main visual purpose of providing a view, increasing or enhancing the general brightness of a space and providing illumination for task performance, The design of building fenestration and window apertures has significant impacts on the quality of light and that people like to have a view outside. It's essential for our sense of security or for supervision of external spaces, and they write, but most importantly, windows connect people to the world outside and give them useful information about the environment they are in. Also, they provide an opportunity for a visual break and a change of scene and focus. So certainly, as I said, a lot of the time here, it was my change of focus from working on Teams all day to just sort of take the time to notice my neighbours walking their dogs, to notice the raindrops gathering on the window frame after a storm, and in this case, doing 2 drawings because I found that we're using pen and ink gave me a better chance than a fine liner. As well, it's worth noting that there is science behind the window view and viewing nature. There's a stump as well as one of the trees along the streetscape there. Roger Ulrich famously wrote a paper in, I think it was the 1980s, where he did a controlled trial in a hospital. Some of the patients had a view of a brick wall in a car park, others had a view of a garden. And unsurprisingly, perhaps, the patients with the view of nature recovered from their illnesses quicker and they required less painkillers while they were in hospital. So what did I get from viewing nature? Well, you're seeing a lot of birds, a lot of insects here. I don't look out over the Normandy countryside like Hockney. But I did, when I started looking, there was a lot of nature outside my very ordinary suburban street. And in fact, it is again worth noting that the UK government have acknowledged that this is an important aspect of our experience of COVID, that getting outdoors, that viewing nature is important. And that indeed there are some sort of significant disparities here for people who don't have this access. Disadvantaged groups appear to gain a larger benefit and have reduced socio-economic related inequalities in health when living in greener communities, Public Health England tell us. So green space and a greener urban environment can also be used as an important tool in the drive to build a fairer society. There's the sun beaming in, if we can remember back in summertime, and my cat staring wistfully out. So as you can see, my neighbours and I benefit from this space. It's low on biodiversity. It doesn't really have a great deal of design to speak of. A few trees, lawn and shrubs, a stump, some washing lines, benches and paths, and some car parking. But nevertheless, this window affords the prospect of the changes of the seasons, the clouds in the sky, the changing colour and density of leaves in the foreground, the borrowed scenery of treetops swaying in the car park in the public park, which is a couple of blocks away. And I've noticed and drawn all of these, the weeds and so on. But I'll focus on the trees and then the birds just in a little more detail as we're seeing them here. First of all, the trees, they are, I believe, a species called Acer tartaceum, a kind of maple. Not like the Japanese maple. In fact, that's a study there of one of them, a little twig I brought inside to look a bit closer. It is, they're kind of a compact hardy street tree that's specified for planting in areas where soils aren't that great and where low maintenance is needed. And the feature that gave me the best clue about their identity was actually the samaras, the delicate winged fruits that started appearing around about now, actually, I think in May. And you can see them just sort of dotted red there. And I must add, by the way, this was a non-socially distanced party that I saw all my neighbours having in May. I've lived there for over 6 years. I'd never seen people get together in that garden like that once. So there's something about COVID and also about the sunshine that we fortunately had this summer that really brought people out and together. And I'm glad I was there to sort of pay attention and document it. So a bit like the trees, I found out what they were. I looked them up online. I sort of had to deduce what species of tree are these. And naming these trees felt a bit like when you recognise the comings and goings of people living in your street. But until you're introduced, you have no idea about their names or where they come from. They're somewhat familiar, but also kind of overlooked and anonymous. But once you know their names, you feel a bit better acquainted. So I noticed quite a bit more about my trees. I call them my trees, in fact, which probably says a lot. There's a wonderful book that I recommend by Peter Wellbeing called The Hidden Life of Trees. And he was a forester who spent several years working in forests and then wrote a book about his observations. So he wasn't drawing, but living with them. And one of the things he notes is that there are sort of fungal networks underground in the root systems of trees that allow them to chemically communicate with each other, to sort of give chemical signals that they're being attacked by insects, for example, and to actually also share nutrients. We call this a vegetation community when they work together like this. And I kind of like the idea that as humans, we do the same thing. There's a community of humans as well as a community of trees. So now on to bird watching, and it's just in time actually for this drawing of a magpie. So I hope you may have been noticing there's a lot of pigeons, but there have been some magpies. It's the European picker. And I ended up researching a bit about this species because a pair of them nested across the street. And so as the Royal Society of Protection for Birds noted, birds can bring nature right into our lives. And I saw jackdaws, swifts, crows, and that quite noisy magpie. And I noticed the nest being built, became quite interested in knowing when the chicks would arrive. And the drawing I just noted there, the colour one where a bird was taking flight, I recall that I sat down to draw and I noticed the parent birds kept coming and going on a very similar flight path. So I watched for a while and I started the drawing. I waited for the bird, did the plants in a way, did the tree, and waited for the bird to take flight to get that moment. And when it did appear, sure enough, it swooped across the street and I registered the wing speed, the angle, the distinctive monochrome pattern, sort of got the outspread wings and the head, but didn't get the line of the tail and couldn't figure out if it was fanned out or in a straight line. And I wanted to get it right, but I didn't want to go online and just look up a photo of a magpie flying. I just sat at the window and I waited. And in that time, it was a beautiful warm evening, beautiful light. I started getting a bit impatient. I was supposed to be getting dinner on, but I just kind of sat and waited. And in the end, as predicted, sure enough, the magpie eventually gave me another one of these repeat flights, and the tail was actually in between. It was sort of partly fanned and partly open. So I was able to capture that composite image and move on. So in a way, my experience almost demanded of me that I stop and notice. So now on to people, and here's Big John on his scooter, which I couldn't draw in one hit, so I kind of cheated slightly and took a photo, but incorporated that into my window view. Here we are in the height of summer. And here are my observations about the people. In fact, what I really was doing was engaging in a pastime that's been shown to be one of the key functions of public and semi-public space, and that is people watching. Many of you will be familiar with the William H. White's work, The Social Life of Small Urban Spaces, from 1980. I quite love on Wikipedia the description of White is that he's an American urbanist, organisational analyst, journalist, and people watcher. So his work has been very influential in how we do observe public space to see the intricacies of how people use space, where and when, to help us inform our designs. And he's found that really people eating lunch, chatting together, playing in fountains, this quantitative and qualitative measurement of what people do often just reveals what I think is intuitively self-evident. But what did I find from observing this particular semi-private space? Well, as I said, I was amazed at how frequently people used it, which I just hadn't noticed before. So There were fleeting moments like putting out the washing, walking past or through, often with dogs, and people stopping and talking with each other while they did that. Chatting to and from the windows, the incidental gatherings, particularly those two benches that we see in the foreground and the background. And in particular, one gentleman was there often with his Pomeranian, and he was there morning and night. And seeing my neighbour with the obvious affection for his companion and the obvious enjoyment he had just chatting to people, even just for a couple of minutes sometimes when they came and went, to me, captured something of the social isolation. And here they are, stopping and having a chat. Sometimes he does look a bit lonely. He's sitting there on his own. But other times it did make me wonder if that was a private garden, if in this complex across the street, if there wasn't this shared garden with this low wall that people could stop and see each other, would he just be sitting at home by himself in his own garden? I think that was just an important aspect of staying connected. And another unprecedented activity on this particular street was gardening. So you may have noted there's some pots and plants and a little guerrilla garden. The guerrilla garden on the corner was there previously, but it got added to during lockdown. And then these other new gardens, a bit of astroturf and some potted plants and things, were a new arrival. Again, I hadn't seen this in over 6 years. And there's been a lot of talking in the media about gardening and connecting with nature as part of our sort of therapeutic experience. So I certainly saw that here. We've also seen, because this is council housing, that there's someone repotting. We've also seen that this is a site where maintenance people come by and actually mow every now and again. So there's occasional evidence of people that were still working throughout lockdown, including healthcare workers who I saw with ambulances a couple of times as well. And I think what these drawings, I hope they capture with the social life and outdoor activity, it's quite prosaic, but a vital element of neighbourliness that's central to healthy and resilient communities at times of crisis. The value of something as seemingly simple as knowing your neighbours cannot be overestimated. There is actually an important piece of work that was done after a heat wave in Chicago in 1995. Tragically, in that 1995 event, over 700 people died in Chicago. I mean, it's an astonishing number. And in the book by Klinkenberg called Heat Wave, A Social Autopsy of Disaster in Chicago, he did a lot of mapping, did a lot of, look at the policies and everything to say, how could this possibly happen in the contemporary world? And he found that, yes, there were some failures of the healthcare system. There were some discrepancies in, disadvantage and advantage. But the main thing, whether people survived or not, was actually about neighbourliness and knowing and being in communities. So in some areas, he found, they were sort of the poor parts of the city, but they were areas where people knew each other, sort of intergenerational families. And his conclusion was it was impossible to die alone there. Someone would come and knock on your door and ask for you. So the other valuable contribution that I think this social space we've been seeing happens when I'm not staring just at the wall, which was also part of my view, it's of course for me. So there's the benefit that I had from being connected to my neighbours, even though it was through this mediating device of the window. I'm observing from a distance. I'm not out there talking to them, although I did do that a little bit actually, said hello. But my social isolation was tempered by seeing the familiar faces of neighbours, sharing in their presence, and despite the distancing of being one floor up and across the street. And sometimes, like those drawings there, I did actually bring some wildflowers from the grass into the house. And there's the Pomeranian I mentioned. So now I'm going to turn from, as we zip through, here we are into August. I'm going to talk about the act of drawing itself. So there's a few other themes here in terms of the content of the drawings that we could talk about, such as even the interior view, the skyscape. But But now I just want to focus on drawing itself as a method and as an experience. So drawing is a process that yields forms of knowledge that are distinct from other forms of representation, I would argue, different from photography. And in a recent article titled Situating Skill, Contemporary Observational Drawing as a Spatial Method in Geographical Research, the artist and geographer Sage Bryce explores, and I quote, the potential of observational drawing as a method for attunement to spatial, temporal, material and cultural relations that play out in the storying of a landscape. Bryce suggests drawing might offer different possibilities, a way of opening up new spaces of encounter. In her case, she was doing field work out in nature and drawing to understand complex landscapes and the natural world and people's engagement with that. But I think the same applies, to us, even if we're drawing urban nature. It could be argued that drawing is very visual, it's a visually dominant thing, that the other senses should be deployed to understand the richness of a place, and that we shouldn't dominate just with our eyes. But I would kind of counteract that and say that, well, it is an important sense. And when we draw, we are engaging with our body as well. There's a movement of our hand. And I actually returned to John Ruskin, whose quote we saw earlier, and that he wrote that it was, to draw is to sort of engage your mind and your eye, but also in a very kind of holistic way. According to the art critic Christopher Newell, he thought that Ruskin's work, and I quote, by the very process of observation, he gained perceptions about the sphere in which he existed and all that there was in it, and by the empirical inspection of phenomena of every kind, he tested what he knew or had been led to believe and refreshed his knowledge of the world. I mean, what a wonderful idea that by drawing you can refresh your knowledge of the world as you know it. And again, it was a challenge at times, particularly here we are by September the 3rd. At times, I didn't think I could see anything new out of this window. I was kind of ready for lockdown to be over and to not be drawing from this window anymore. But that's the thing about the sea, about the weather, about the light, and actually about existence, that every moment is different and fresh and new. And sometimes we feel a bit miserable, sometimes we feel a bit tired, but that in itself is our experience. And that's part of what I was also capturing and trying to pay attention to, even if it was just for this one little moment each day. So places of any kind, such as the streetscape and shared garden here, provide constant change and the opportunity to be refreshed through repeatedly paying attention. So at times I was paying attention to the view, I was also paying attention in a way to myself. And this leads me to the Therapeutic Act. I will just point about on this one drawing, by the way, of this of John sitting on his own. I remember it was on a weekend. It was quite a sunny day actually, and I sat down and I was really enjoying the view of the tree. It was just going into autumn colour, and I was going to draw it. I was already sort of prepared. I was looking, got my pen and paper out, decided I'd do a pencil drawing, a large one, just not in my sketchbook. And John went and sat down on that chair and he bowed his head. And I just looked and I thought, well, I have to draw him. I can't ignore this. I can't ignore this person and his isolation. So the drawing kind of changed in response to that. So getting back to this idea of drawing as therapy, sometimes it can be a positive and energising practice. So on days when I was not feeling particularly inspired, I'd nevertheless pick up my sketchbook and pen, take my place by the window, kind of wait for inspiration to arrive. And sometimes it did arrive in the form of a new sight or just something I hadn't noticed before. And I'm really interested when I invite you all to do some drawings over the next couple of weeks to see what you might notice about a view that you probably think you already know. But also, sometimes the energy kind of generated itself. So I could start off being a bit flat, a bit uninspired, and then in the time I was drawing, I could actually feel my mood change. And Ruskin described this once, and I'm just going to quote from him. Lying on the bank of a cart road in the sand, with no prospect whatsoever but a small aspen tree against the blue sky. Languidly, but not idly, I began to draw it, and as I drew, the languor passed away. The beautiful lines insisted on being traced without weariness. More and more beautiful they became as each rose out of the neck of the rest and took its place in the air. With wonder increasing every instant, I saw that they composed themselves. So in this wonderful description, I think Ruskin, you can almost sense his arm tracing the line of a tree up the page and kind of him getting a sense of this tree growing. This sort of, he says, a small aspen, something that didn't look that remarkable until he started to draw it. He describes a physical and emotional shift that grows in intensity as the act of drawing the tree proceeds. And I've done that sometimes. Oh, this one, by the way, there was a sudden sun shower and the person had to run out and get their washing off the line. And I very quickly tried to do the same and draw them before they both disappeared. So as we come very close to the end of the drawings, I've got just one other quote here. Grayson Perry, the Turner Prize winning artist, had a TV series on during lockdown in April this year, and he dedicated an hour-long program to the view out the window. There's the Pomeranian being walked at night, by the way, so even at night time there's still things going on. It had a night light around his collar. But back to Perry. He ended his program on the view from the window by saying, "You look through that window with only your eyes. All we have at the moment is the view out the window. We're in lockdown. But it's not what we're looking at. The important thing is that we all have our own vision of the world. It's our own lens that's in our heads that's made up of our emotions, our experience, our identities, our bodies. When you look out through the window, you're not just looking through a piece of glass, you're looking out through yourself." So as you can see, this has been my view. So it's not objective, it is very subjective. You're seeing a bit of my mood, my experience, as it were. And in fact, I've just ended here with a bit of a photo, not fully panoramic, but shows a main part of that same scene that you've been seeing. That is indeed quite private, but also in the same way, it's also kind of public. And I don't know if anyone's picked up, but as I conclude, the final, if I do go back, the reason that is the last drawing and it's done in, second last, that one gives a bit of a hint because that sign did actually appear in our front yard on the 14th, and on the 15th, it was the last night that I spent in my home because it's now rented out and I've moved on. And so I drew with one of those permanent markers because I'd been busily packing everything up in boxes and writing, you know, which room, kitchen, first floor, and so on, with a big marker pen. So perhaps some of the more anxious drawings that came toward the end there were all about me also going through the fun and games of moving house and actually saying goodbye to that window. So what have I learnt from this? Certainly I make no claims for comprehensive coverage or documentation of all that's been taking place. You know, we'd have to put a camera in front of this or do questionnaires, or there'd be lots of other methods we could use to really try to quantify this view and its effects. But I think drawing does provide a particular quality of information about human health and well-being, a sort of deep or nuanced understanding of human behaviour, of qualitative spatial phenomena, and you know, it's a method in its own right. So I'm yet to really look through all these drawings in a systematic way, but to sort of classify them and so on. But initially, I'd say that we can see that the quality of the design, so not necessarily the beauty of the architecture, but having windows that look out over green space, and that my neighbours themselves have windows that look out onto that space and that they can talk through them and see each other, is really quite critical in alleviating social isolation and providing a connection to nature. I would say that the other aspect of this as a project has been that paying attention mindfully can bring health benefits and new forms of understanding when the object of attention is the external world. And that by doing that through drawing, I mean, I could sit and just stare out the window, and that was part of the process indeed, but by drawing, it did add a different level of awareness and noticing that, and at a very basic level, the other advice by Public Health England has been that during lockdown, another thing we can try to do is to set small daily goals. I feel that things are still, we're still making progress. So it did become a bit of a daily goal for me to keep doing them. So in short, paying attention to what's outside this specific window and my own responses to it has been therapeutic. I think it's provided me with a source of well-being which I may not have otherwise experienced, and got me away from the screen at least once a day. And the combination of drawing and mindful attention, I think, is worth investing the time in, regardless of whether some of the drawings are ones that I feel were successful, unsuccessful, good, bad, accurate, inaccurate. I think, in fact, that was also part of the reason I shared them all. Not because I think they're worth kind of, you know, immortalising. Quite the opposite. I think I cringe at some of them actually as drawings, if I'm completely honest. But that's been, I wanted to show that actually it's okay. The drawing itself as a process is more important than the sort of quality of the end product. Just on this one, because, you know, we've talked about drawing for well-being, I hope there's some insights here in terms of, you know, the sort of salutogenic or the health-giving properties of green space and of the importance of social connectivity and shared space. But actually getting onto this, I'll just complete the information about well-being and the fact that COVID has been such a difficult time, I think, for many of us. And this was one of the strategies I used to take time out for myself. But there is some other information out there for anybody who that might resonate with and who are thinking, yeah, I probably do need to take some time to think about how I'm getting on. Architects Mental Wellbeing Forum has a really lovely toolkit, including one that was about COVID-specific strategies. And as you can see here, the ABS, they actually did a time to sketch event themselves in September for 1 hour. And then the RIBA, again, thanks for supporting this event tonight, but they've also got their own online information. And if anyone did want to know a bit more about mindfulness, there's plenty of information online, but I think the Oxford Mindfulness Centre has got a lot of podcasts that they've done throughout COVID. In fact, I think they run them on Wednesday evenings. There might be one tonight, but I'd recommend them as perhaps a first port of call. But I think we saw a few people might already have a mindfulness practice. That was it.